Nobody can explain origin. They guess about origin, but science cannot explain the word bara. How do you have something? How do you have something out of nothing? It's because it's a unique kind of creating that only God can do. Now I'm only touching that this morning. That's not where I'm going to spend the majority of my time. But we need to understand that word and that type of creating before we can understand the next type of creating. And that is the word used in Genesis chapter 3 when God forms Adam and Eve. When God forms Adam and Eve, he pulls together what?
Dust.
He pulls together dust, dirt, clay, mud, whatever it is. One of my nicknames for Pottery is playing in the mud. So, because essentially I am, as you can tell, playing in the mud, and if you get much closer, we could have a splash zone up here. But in Genesis 3, essentially what it's expressing is that God is playing in the mud. And God pulls together the dust of the earth, the clay, the dirt, if you will, and he begins to fashion out of it something that had never been seen in creation. Everything else in creation came about as a result of bara. Everything. The oceans, the universe, the mountains, the trees, the birds, the fish, all of the animals that Adam would later name, all came as a result of bara. God said, let it be, and it was so. But in Genesis 3, God gets down in the dirt and fashions, by playing in the mud, a person. And the word in Hebrew that is used for that is yatzar. And what yatzar means is to create. But it also means to create out of what's already here. To give additional purpose to something that already commonly exists. So God gets down and he yatzar Adam. And then from Adam, he takes a rib and he yatzars Eve. And the idea within Hebrew, when you hear the word yatzar, is yes, it's being made from what's already here. It's being made from what's already commonly available. But it also carries the idea of giving additional purpose, giving additional identity to whatever it is you're making. So when God takes the dust that he spoke into being, hands off. Okay, again, a very unique, very only God kind of creating. God then takes his presence, his being, he becomes as physical as he needs to be in order to fashion together what he spoke into being. And personally, not only make something with additional purpose, but set an example. It's an expression. Oh, that's very good. I like that. Can I keep that? Can I use that? Okay. The reason I like expression is because a poem, if you think in the classic sense of literature, and I'm going to take you all to the English class that many of you hated because you would try and write a poem, or you'd quick do the haiku, and because the haiku had the least amount of words, and all you had to do was get the meter right, and it didn't really matter what it said, and your teacher would be like, good job, it's a haiku. Whereas some of you would try and do what they call deconstructed poetry or unstructured poetry, where you could just write it in whatever form, and as long as it sort of sounded poetic, you'd get an A. And then some of you engaged in the more classic aspect of poetry, where you would actually fight through using meter and rhyme and carefully chosen words to take the reader on an adventure with as few words as possible. That's essentially what poetry is. You go on an adventure, you go deep into an expression of something with as few words as possible. And those words are very pointed. They can be very emotional, but they're designed to have every single word interlocked together is designed to have an impact. That's poetry, right? So when Ephesians 2:10 says that you are God's poema, you're his poetry. Doesn't that sound a lot like the psalm we heard earlier? Mm-hmm. For you knit me together in my mother's womb. Before I was even born, you had purpose for me. That's yatsar. That's poetry. That means God took every aspect of who he designed you to be, and there's not a single part of your personality that he has not intended from the very beginning to use. Is that amazing to you? Yeah. Even those parts of your personality that other people kind of look at you and you know, they're the parts of your personality why people don't hang out with you. You know that when you're kind of in that part of your personality, that's why people find another room. That's why people don't call you, because you're in that mode right now. So we're just not going to deal with you. Even those parts of your personality are parts of the personality God knit into you with purpose. And if you look carefully at that word or that phrase in Ephesians 2:10, it says, "You're his workmanship, created to do what? Good works, which Christ prepared when? In advance." So before you were even here, before you're even aware of it, God has an idea of what he's going to do with you. Because from the beginning, and in advance of you even being here, God knit you together with purposes that he's planned in advance for you to do. So it's not alive, but it can have a personality. And this little piece of clay here is having a personality with me. You may not be able to see it, but I can feel it. And so I'm having to pause to make sure that I'm paying attention to what it's telling me so that I don't do something other than what it's supposed to be doing. Because we may have a design that the artist has in mind for us, but when we decide we don't like that, this is what we end up with. Sometimes we fight that design that God's trying to give us. It doesn't turn out so well. God's trying to turn us into a mug or a bowl, and we decide we're going to do something else, and so then we kind of force God to make something pretty out of it. Artists call those happy accidents. But when it comes to humans, those can be messy accidents. Because if any of you have ever gone through a season of life where things are going other than where God designed them to go or God intended them to go, and you're out there on your own as a result of your own willfulness, it gets pretty messy, doesn't it? And when it gets messy, we're not always sure what to do with it. And it's because we've stepped beyond the artist's design and we've stepped into our own design. That culture just kind of believed you are whatever you feel, or you're whatever these gods tell you to be, or you had to be whatever these gods would accept to give you good harvest or what have you. And the idea that there was one God who was all-powerful, who had fashioned you together from the very beginning of your existence with a purpose, was foreign to them. I mean, if you go into a lot of Roman mythology, humans were playthings for the gods. We were not crafted items to be treasured. We were not unique individuals designed with a purpose and a plan to accomplish something that God intended to do. We were just pawns. So when Paul says this to the Ephesians, it's important for them to understand it, because this may be the first time they're encountering it. And living out your design is what it is to be obedient to God. When I was growing up in the church, we used to talk a lot about, you aren't what you do, you are who you are. And there was all this discovery of just be, don't do, just be. And it didn't take but a decade for us to finally get past that and be like, you know what, we're not much of a be without a do. We can think about being all kinds of be, but if I'm just sitting around, I am a something, I'm a tree. Really? Where's the leaves? Where's the fruit? Oh, you're not a tree. You're sitting there homing. You're a person sitting oming. So it didn't take long for us to finally say, if there's a be, there has to be a do. And so we've actually come back to Scripture more recently in our culture. And you be you kind of carries this idea of like, go and do what is uniquely you, right? So that's where we are in our culture right now. You be you. So that's great because you know what that's expressing? Romans 2:13. Go and be who God has designed you to be. Now the trick there is we'll often go and be whoever the culture tells us to be. And I've got two roads I want to go down right now. Parents, if you're listening to this, tune in heavily. Teenagers, some of this you're going to be like, okay, I kind of live this every day, so it's not a big surprise to me. Ever since the family unit is broken down and neighborhoods are not the same as what they were, and we've got kids in neighborhoods whose the only parents that are allowed to tell the kid what to do are their own parents, because, when I was growing up, if you went over to Mrs. Jones's house, Mrs. Jones was your mom for the day. And if you messed up at Mrs. Jones's house, you got in trouble with Mrs. Jones, and when you got home, your parents had gotten a phone call, and you got trouble at home because you got in trouble at Mrs. Jones's house. And amen on that. Okay, right? Okay, so now you recognize how many hands actually went up. Less than a third of the room. The way that it is today, you go to Mrs. Jones's house, and Mrs. Jones scolds you, then your mom goes and punches Mrs. Jones in the face because nobody's supposed to tell your kid how to behave, right?
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
And then you come home, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart, that you got, Mrs. Jones, she's just a mean old lady, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you go play some video games? Because right now I'm trying to deal with my Facebook and my Snapchat, and I'm really tired because I had a long day at work. Now, I'm caricaturing parents, but this is where teenagers sort of feel. Am I right? Is this kind of going into your world? Okay. So, and then parents are so distracted by work, by technology, that the family unit no longer gathers around the table the way that they used to. They don't talk eyeball to eyeball. When they're talking, it's like this. And, yeah, I hear you, sweetheart. And so without the face-to-face communication, without the interaction, it's gotten to the point now where teens do not have adults speaking into their lives and into teen culture anymore. The teens are wired directly into cultural faucets, aka Facebook, other social media, the news, anything else they find online, and they have their own culture. It is Lord of the Flies right now among teenagers, and if you don't realize that, it's time to wake up. Because teens are leading teens, not adults. And so teens are no longer living the design they've been given because they don't have wise counsel, they don't have mentoring that's actually helping them discover their design and their ability. They are living whatever the culture and the pod that they belong to tells them they are. And so whatever gifts and ability they have is being taken captive into whatever the culture says. And the really sad reality of that is, the reason it's happening with teens is because it's already happened to the adults. Let that land on you for a minute. And teenagers get frustrated because then they can't go to adults for help, and if they do, they're shut out of their pod. And if they're shut out of their pod, now who are they? Because they have no other perspective telling them who they are. And nobody else showing them that God loves them and has a purpose and a plan and a design for them. But I have to tell you a little bit more about pottery. So for all of these pieces that I make, when I am done with this rough shaping, there's always finished work. Okay? So when I'm working the clay, and you saw that piece that flopped earlier, when I'm working the clay, there's always the rough work. And that normally involves getting the lump of clay to be a basic form or a basic shape, and I take it as far as I can on the wheel. And afterwards, if I, say I wanted to make this into a picture, so, there's a little bit of work that I'm going to do, and some of you are going to gasp, you're like, you worked so hard to make that a circle. But, so you deform it. And you deform it intentionally in line with its purpose. And when you deform it in line with its purpose, I can give it a spout. I'm just working the clay, and I work it down to a point where, as I get better at making spouts, I can actually make a spout that doesn't drip. Because some of you have had those spouts, right, where it just kind of comes out and you pour it and it runs down the front. You You can work on that, and that's something that potters wrestle through. They look at their product and they say, I don't like the fact that one had a drippy spout. I'm going to make one without a drippy spout. There's a fashioning that goes on afterwards, and then when it's all done, being on the wheel and having the rough fashioning, we take it off, we let it dry. After it dries, and all the water must get out of it, because if the water is left in it, and I put that in a kiln, once it hits 230-some degrees, what happens to water? It boils. And imagine what happens to pottery when there's water trapped inside the clay and it's trying to boil. It will literally explode inside the kiln. So it's very, very important the clay must be bone dry when it goes in. But when it goes in clay. It goes in dry clay. The only difference between when it was here and when it goes in the kiln is that it was wet clay without a shape, and now it's dry clay with a shape. The water's gone. That's really the only difference, besides the shaping. But when it reaches somewhere just over 2,000 degrees, the clay starts to shift its nature. See, inside the clay, there are particles like silica, which silica is in sand, and we use silica to make what? Glass. There's that inside clay, and there's many other minerals and chemicals that come together, and when it's that hot, they melt. And when they melt, it goes from being clay to being a ceramic piece. And the goal of what God is doing is to move us from the shapeable and the malleable in the time we have here to prepare us for the time where we will be imperishable. So that's big picture, right? That's the ultimate transition when everything's finished. What's amazing about God is while He's working us as we're clay, He can do bits and pieces of that along the way. He does something amazing like that with us. That as He's shaping you and as He's forming you throughout all the years that you're alive, there are pieces that very early on in your journey, He vitrifies. He hardens into place. And he amazing God thing. I don't know how He does it. I don't know how He can harden one part of me and say, yeah, keep that. And He can take another part of me and say, no, we're still working on that. I don't know how He can do that because it doesn't work in our physical world. But somehow, spiritually, God does that. Death is a change of state. From the perishable to the imperishable. Regardless of where you are, at any point in the journey, God is shaping things into you, and He's shaping things out of you. So in our last few moments together, I'm going to be silent, and I'm just going to make several things out of one lump of clay. And as I'm doing that, I want you to ask yourself those two questions. The first question is, right now in my life, where I am on my journey, what is God shaping out of me? Let God speak to you in that moment and understand that God is shaping those out of you. And then just watch as I'm making it and say, God, in whatever way you're shaping me out, and shaping that out of me, I give you permission. Just give Him permission to shape it out. And I trust that He's going to walk that journey with you, and He's going to continue to just take it. Just give Him permission to do it. And then the second question is, God, at this point in my life, in this part of my journey, what are you shaping into me? Whatever you're shaping into me, God, I give you permission. Shape it into me. So would you join me in that for these last few minutes? Let those two questions sort of settle in. And when I'm done with this piece of clay, we'll trust that the Holy Spirit has spoken to you in all the ways that He needs to, and He's laid a foundation to accomplish the rest of the work which He's prepared in advance for you to do.